Okay. Hi, everybody. Hi, Patricia. Welcome to this talk entitled On Witnessing Otherworlds. It's a diagrammatic talk with Patricia Reed. Patricia is an artist, writer, and designer based in Berlin, whose recent writings made Pages Magazine, The New Normal, MIT, eFlex, and so on. And Reed is also part of the Urbanomic working group, whose Xenofeminist Manifesto was republished by Verso Books in 2018, with additional translations in many languages. And we're really happy to be presenting this talk. We want to thank the Daniel's Waterfront Corporation for supporting it. This talk is part of a program called Shape Shift, which is part of Sugar's transitional program concerning other life forms, and now a transitional program while we're adjusting to a new way of consuming talks and talking to people. And so this program is a bridge between different themes of transformation, consumption, and mutation between our last exhibition and our next exhibition and our ongoing programming cycle. And so, yeah, I'm going to give it over to Patricia. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Inya. It's really kind of you to invite, and I'm really bummed not to be there because I was supposed to be in Toronto live, but obviously some much more important circumstances took over since then. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm sure a lot of us have been experiencing something similar where we're having a hard time focusing these last weeks, maybe even casting some doubt as to like the relevance of writing or art practice at all in this moment. But I think like one way to, at least that I'm sort of trying to come to grips slowly with this moment is with a kind of hopefully heavy dose of humility. And I don't mean that in the sense of like shying away from engaging with the crisis, but to really try to learn from it, and like to try to think about how it transforms us, or how it ought to transform us. So obviously those kinds of questions don't happen overnight, and they don't really allow for us to, have a certain theoretical framework and just start plugging in this situation, trying to force it into those sort of coordinates. So yeah, I think the kind of emergent lesson that at least I'm trying to take from this is that we can't just apply, one-to-one a lot of our existing sort of theoretical frameworks to kind of grapple with this magnitude. So maybe at this point I can share some slides, because we did promise a diagrammatic talk. So that's your cue. Thank you. Yeah, so but I mean, that said, like without, this isn't going to be some kind of like hot take or anything at all of the current crisis, but hopefully I think they can be maybe read adjacent to the specific moment, because they address questions of world building, which is like a question of how to build otherworldly configurations. So perhaps there's a kind of degree resonance given the enormity of the challenge that lies ahead in the years-long playing out of this crisis, as it sort of fully integrates social inequities, non-human actors, as well as geopolitical asymmetries, and all of that on a backdrop of planetary climate change. So the kind of humility that I'm talking about required to face this crisis is not unambitious, or a kind of type of humility that is equal to withdrawal, kind of on the other hand. So yeah, so basically I'll start with a pretty simple premise and sort of try to build out from that. So despite the seeming naivete in speaking of a better world, to speak or think of a better world is to speak or think of a world that does not yet exist in the concrete here and now. So a better world is always located in the somewhere and somewhen of another world. So it's in this way that any struggle for betterment is also a struggle over learning to witness a world that does not yet concretely exist. So while the determination of what betterment specifically entails is always historically situated, and of course it constitutes the political object of contestation, but formally speaking, a better world always pertains to a there and then of a concretely inexistent world. So just to be clear, what do I mean when I say world? So I use the word world just to refer to a specific configuration of coexistence where life activities take place. So it's basically a space of inhabitation. And in that way, a world is always bound to processes of localization. And by that, I just mean, like, you know, as Gayatri Spivak infamously said, we don't live in a globe, right? So we don't live in an abstraction. We maybe know of abstractions, but we inhabit a world. So a world appears to us concretely because an impersonal conceptual domain allows for its shared recognition in a certain way. So the perceptual codes of sense-making that make up a concrete world create a conceptual enclosure or border, making it very difficult to think and see and sense outside that frame. This enclosure is similar to a concept called the episteme from Foucault, and it's that which kind of configures what is perceived as relevant or irrelevant to question, what is possible or impossible to think, and how the distinctions between sameness and difference become sort of naturalized as categories of common sense. So the enclosure of a world, it conditions experience because it sets the conceptual conditions of experience. So that's basically to say that worlds come into existence through particular frames of reference. So frames of reference serve as a kind of like rudimentary conceptual schemas for systems of activity and thought, and they set a vantage point from which modes of reasoning, sense-making, material, and relational practices accordingly derive. So as an epistemic example outlined by Reza Negrestani, the question, and sort of illustrated on the diagram, the question of how long it takes the Earth to revolve around the sun is, of course, a legitimate question within Copernican frames of reference, whereas the question of how long it takes the sun to circle the Earth is a relevant question from the perspective of Ptolemaic frames of reference. So basically, each referential framework enables certain questions while it disables others, and where certain vectors of inquiry are opened or closed depending on the initial perspectival constraints. So in this case, like where the Earth is schematically situated. But for spaces of inhabitation, which is more, you know, my my interest tonight, social configurations, frames of reference are often fictional, which is to say they're conceptual idealizations. So this fictional status, it doesn't diminish their significance or power to orient a system in a certain way, you know, absolutely to the contrary. I think exemplary of this and a kind of lingering consequence is Adam Smith's, you know, infamous fictional frame of reference of the, you know, of the egoist human, which was deployed in order to validate his system of political economy. So as Hans Wenger wrote, you know, Smith required this kind of causal interpretation of human behavior in order to bring the whole of political economy into an ordered system. So since human actions are, of course, exceptionally complicated, they raise a pretty big problem or conundrum when you try to condense them to just causal forces alone. And yet, despite the actuality of, you know, humans being cooperative or generous or just, you know, having sheer behavioral habits, Smith fashioned his model with the as-if assumption that the driving force of all human activity is always and solely egoism. So such an abstractive and fictional reduction of human activity, of course, this may be useful in some cases of modeling, since all, you know, complex situational models require some degree of simplification. Yet, as Wenger noted, it's when this oversimplified fiction becomes axiomatic and, you know, so-called reliable conclusions are derived from it, that the value of the model becomes, quote, positively ruinous as hypothesis or dogma, end quote. So, while Weger's example was intended to illustrate the hazards in conflating this selectively reductive, abstractive fiction of the egoist human with the, quote, complete range of causes and facts of reality, what we could kind of think of as a toxic reduction as opposed to a rigorous reduction, I think it nonetheless demonstrates the consequential weight and responsibility of inventing frames of reference as a schematic point of departure. Basically, because those frames of reference then produce a series of cascading consequences. So, more than a century after Wenger's book, it's quite old, Philosophy of As If, a century after his book, to describe this sort of obstinate adherence to this egoist human frame of reference as dogmatic would be a kind of an understatement. However, I think the broad point to be made and sort of relevant in this example as well as in the solar system examples is that conceptual frames of reference, be they fictional or otherwise, serve as a perspectival constraint for world building. They orient a world and its contents in logical compliance with that perspective. So it's in this way that the creation of other worlds becomes totally inseparable from the task of devising frames of reference for that very other world. Sorry, can I make the presentation full screen? I will try. Better? Just ping and say so. Okay, I'm assuming that's a go. So as a prerequisite for all worlds, frames of reference are unique and distinct to each world, yet they're functionally universal, since they are what makes any world operational. And by operational, I don't mean smooth functioning. It can be totally dysfunctional, pragmatically speaking. But such a claim resonates with Sylvia Wynter's elaboration of Fanon's sociogenic principle, which, just to put it very simply for the context of what we're getting at tonight, is a kind of general description of how particular human worlds become reproducible. And so for Wynter, the foundational perspective set by any and all regionally specific worlds is bound to conceptions of being human, what she more eloquently calls genres of being human. And these genres of being human or modes of being human that belong to these worlds. So this forms a sort of anchoring point of reference. So those worlds then evolve social and knowledge structures, as well as incentives and behavior in accordance with the idealization established by said human conception. So it's here where we can note the force of the toxically reductive egoist human as the primary referent, driving the self-storytelling logic of our existing world. It's a regionally and historically specific picture of the human that gets consequently inflated to the global proportions that has manifest as liberal monohumanism or homo economicus in the parlance of Wynter. So the inflation of this frame of reference to a global scale not only leads to the erasure of worlds in the plural in favor of a very constricted unilateral world, it also works to corrode the possibility space for the unending project of human self-conception, from which other worlds would logically evolve in both sort of schematic and heuristic ways. So just to step back now, so what does any of this have to do with spaces of inhabitation outside of some, academic thought experiments, especially as we're, facing such a crisis? So I think it's maybe useful here to turn to Walter Benjamin's very succinct definition of catastrophe that he outlined in the Arcades project. So Benjamin understood catastrophe as a missed opportunity. So unlike conventional associations of the term referring to this kind of unsuspecting event that punctures the everyday, for Benjamin, catastrophe relates to continuity, specifically historical continuity, where a, quote, critical moment has been lost, having become engulfed by the, quote, spirit of routine, end quote. So clearly this has resonance with our moments. It is not the situation per se that is catastrophic, but rather the prospect of staying the course or maintaining normality once the acute turbulence of the situation wanes. So opportunity in the historical dimension inferred by Benjamin, it pertains, just to be clear, it pertains to the deprivatized realm of social transformation. So although it affects the personal, we're not talking about individual chance taking here. So while unanticipated and tragic events will always, of course, sporadically thwart even the most sophisticated of probability calculations, those occurrences alone do not constitute the catastrophic. So tragedy and catastrophe are not interchangeable. And what distinguishes them is that tragedy discloses symptoms of underlying causal forces and coexistential logics that ought to compel conscious reappraisal. Whereas catastrophe marks a rejection of that reappraisal, whether that's through sheer hubristic stubbornness or indifferent ignorance. So the catastrophic lies in remaining fundamentally unchanged, unlearned, unmoved by disruptions, be those disruptions epistemic, environmental, economic, socio-normative, often, probably a combination of all. So as a continuous attachment to the way familiar worlds are configured, no matter their condition, catastrophe marks a shunning of possibility in favor of staying the course, no matter the consequence. So to put it just very bluntly, to remain calm and carry on is the catastrophe. So in the context of worlds and world making, we can say that catastrophe arises when a world as it currently is inflated to the status of the only possible world. So diagrammatically thought, catastrophe can be seen as the reinforcement of the contour of a particular concrete world, including its configuration and conditioning of perception. So this reinforcement involves an endorsement of the frames of reference that legitimize and govern its condition. And just to be clear, this endorsement is performed whether it's explicitly affirmed or simply unconsciously practiced, and it's usually the latter. So catastrophe as missed historical opportunity is basically a doubling down on an existing world historical contour as if it is impermeable, total, or complete. So otherwise said, catastrophe is the residue of ahistorical being and thought, insofar as it entails an ethical and cognitive refusal to contend with the actual contingency of history belonging to any world, including, of course, the artifact of the human self-picture that belongs to that world. So in such a refusal, the particular frames of reference that belong to a world are sustained and rehearsed as if they're an invariant fact or law that basically go to enforce processes of naturalization. You often hear this when people say, criticize a proposal or demand, and you hear be realistic. Well, this is a kind of reinforcement of certain frames of reference. So considering that what it means to have a history, as Negrostani has noted, is to labor against the self-referential semblance of historical completeness in order to find ways to repurpose these pathways unseen by the past. Catastrophe basically indexes a refusal of this meaningful labor. So when we think of futurity as kind of unglued from this frivolity of just twinkling gadgetry or novelty, and understood rather as a struggle for other histories, catastrophe as a vector of continuity can be seen as an aversion to create demands on the future. The compounded effects of such an aversion are that the transformative demands futurity reciprocally makes upon us are also evaded or ignored. So catastrophe is then equal to the active prevention or indifferent arrestation of transformation in this kind of twin sense, manifest in the unreasoned perpetuation of given frames of reference, underwriting the logic and reproducibility or continuity of a particular world configuration. So in Benjamin's dialect, we talked about his term catastrophe. He also introduced another term called critical moment. And by critical moment, this is for him when, quote, the status quo threatens to be preserved, end quote. So following this thought, we can then infer that these operations of preservation can only be deemed or understood as threatening when a reasoned analysis of our present world in its sort of current arrangement is mentally extended into the future and is, considered or adjudicated as harmful, unjust, or undesirable. So we can only come to diagnose the perpetuation of the status quo as a threat because of cognitive and ethical investments in the future, demanding of us at a minimum to care about existing inconceivable risks and harms, as Thomas Moynihan has observed in his kind of pursuit of extinction studies. So stated differently, the perceptibility of threat in the continuation of the present is only possible because of our capacity to care for A, that which is immediately damaging and for which discontinuity is desired in the future, or B, that which is conceivable as a probable risk, yet is not yet fully, concretized in the here and now. So this threat of continuity is entirely distinct from many, popular doomsday tales where threats are often treated as, purely external or alien to current world configurations. So I think the threat of continuity is quite important because it stands apart since it basically addresses the imminent menace of uncaring for futural risks and the reciprocal demands for transformation those prognosticated risks ought to catalyze within us. So catastrophe as a missed opportunity is basically the historical receipt of this uncaring, whether it's enacted deliberately or through pure negligence. So while it's been kind of centuries-long achievement of human thought to even be able to conceive of or imagine our own species extinction, the 21st century is quite particular. Since it's one where this epistemic abstraction of human extinction is kind of waning, not because the premise is invalid, of course, but because its actualization has become more proximate beyond this kind of intellectual deliberation. So when the continuity of our unilateral, inflated world as it currently is comes to be foreseeable as an existential threat at planetary dimensions, the persistent frames of reference that sort of coax us along this continuous path can be understood as nothing other than toxic. So in this way, the threat of continuity can be seen as a sort of destructive residue of unrealized opportunity. So what goes on in this drive of catastrophic continuity is basically a sort of unyielding preservation of an existing world's frames of reference. And these basically play out in the rehearsal of their so-called proper contents and undeliberated conventions of thought, thereby affirming the discursive and practical configuration of that world. It's how concepts not only sort of calcify into dogmatism, but how the capacity to reason other worlds, not of the concrete here and now, is basically progressively eroded. So at work here is this adamant attachment to the familiarity of the world as it's currently known, where the comfort of what is customarily thought, seen, and heard operates as a kind of compulsive automatism. So what may initially be dismissed as, innocuous, mere habits of thought, they can mutate into mental quiescence under the influence of this kind of analgesic force of familiar frames of reference, ones that ultimately manufacture harm because they sow conceptual paralysis. So rejection or non-engagement with the unfamiliar in either passive or active ways amounts to the fixity of a world as it is, where Achille Mbembe calls upon us to cure our souls from such human-inflicted ills. So he always talks about this like mental self-amputation with this sort of non-negotiation of that which is unfamiliar. So as a thinker of debordering, Mbembe's oeuvre primarily reflects, of course, the geopolitical domain, yet the principle of debordering, I think, also should extend to this conceptual domain as well, foregrounding a sort of pedagogic necessity for exposure, vital contamination, and permeability. So without this conceptual contamination, that's a kind of, the infecting of what Alexandra Perici, I like her expression, which she calls the body mind. So without this infection of the body mind by something unknown to it, no learning or cognitive adjustability is possible. So while today there's the call for unlearning proliferates, I just want to be clear that I think there's simply no such option for unlearning, because unlearning basically speciously presupposes a surplus of knowledge that one can afford to selectively dispense of. There's only learning put to the service of conceptual dehabituation, which is, I think, what unlearning is trying to gesture to. So there's only learning put to the service of conceptual dehabituation as a labor of thought, and this is enabled by debordered exposure. So just to almost wrap up, so to put an affirmative valence on Benjamin's definition of catastrophe, we can say that escaping it demands the construction of opportunity. So first, opportunity needs to be considered as a sort of mutually transformative, consequence of a critical diagnosis that is both inward and outward directed. So it's not just bound to this kind of standalone diagnosis that, critique often stops there, and in so doing sort of ends up upholding the world that it is, even as a negative object. And second, by construction, what I just want to convey is that opportunity is not something that can simply be revealed. It's not subject to unveiling, nor is it a ready-at-hand condition. So opportunities are not self-evident pathways suddenly appearing from nowhere to be, passively or patiently hoped for. They require enabling conditions. So the space of possibility implied by opportunity requires fabrication. And this task is both conceptual, so possibilities need to be made available to thought, as well as material, so possibilities need to be realizable at the level of practice. So as an immanent procedure, opportunity is crafted in the here and now of a given, situated or localized world, yet it is done so to enable departure from those given configurations. So basically a resituated perspective, including the frames of reference required to achieve such perspectival shifts. So in this way, opportunity as enablement is not the creation of a fully determinate path. It's not some like teleology here, but it's rather the intervention into what isness of a given world, mediated by the mental schematic of what could be of another world. Because this construction of opportunity, it can't really take place without meticulously nourishing capacities to make other worlds intelligible. There are basically transformations upon the activity of thought required to realize transitions from world diagnosing to world making. So since the agency to think in existent worlds cannot occur exclusively through critical thought alone, the genre of thinking needed to access worlds that do not yet exist, as Nikud has written, quote, requires modeling our understanding of reality as a space of what it could be, end quote, rather than remaining bound to what it is. So I think what's important to highlight in Hood's formulation is that reality is cognized not only as something to understand in ever more depth, like a model of reality bound exclusively to discovering its invariant laws at increasingly either hyper macro or hyper micro scales, but reality is also simultaneously conceived as a possibility space for variation or for tinkering otherwise. So the consequence of this approach to reality is that it's both variant and invariant at once, meaning the threshold between what is and what could be is not a question of a kind of degree zero absolute novelty, nor is reality, pictured as merely the result of social construction, but it's rather a space of synthesis between description. So this is the analysis or the diagnosis of the contents of an existing world, including the judgments and reasons for demanding its reconfiguration, right? The political imperative, and possibility, so the opportunity of imminent affordance of another world. So it's a synthesis between description and possibility. So the agency to construct opportunity as an otherworldly project is bound to this synthetic dynamic of thought. That's in the capacity not only to understand and evaluate the conditions of a world, but to purposefully reconstruct it from the inside out. So the synonym for this synthetic operation of thought is imagination. This is so because imagination is the faculty perceive in the mind that which is not available to immediate sensation, so the other world, right? The other world is not yet there as a site through which one can even have an experience. So imagination is a representational force since it entails the making of mental pictures of something that is absent or non-present, and it's in this faculty that a corresponding sense of freedom can be found. A form of freedom located in the agency to extrapolate from the purely diagnostic understanding of the what isness making up an existing world, which is already difficult enough, but an agency also towards the variant space, variant possibility space of world building. So opportunity is the kind of affirmation of an exit from catastrophe is bound to the collective enactment of detachment from the what isness of a given world. This requires unbinding from given frames of reference, including the conditioning of the senses implied by them. That, and these, the frames of reference are also, they self-referentially entrench a familiar world and determine its particular configuration. So this kind of unbinding entails the coordination of collective sense as to the permeability of the boundary conditions enclosing a particular world. And this, as I've noted, it's quite a difficult task since the enclosures of worlds perpetuate appearances of impermeable completeness that are underwritten by perspectives that reinforce such appearances. So it's nothing less than a collective labor in learning how to become a witness to the incompleteness of a world and to testify to the irrelevant frames of reference that make a given world concretely inhabitable, especially, of course, when that given world proffers inhospitable conditions. So averting the threat of continuity requires of us to care about existing and prognosticated harms and learn how to synthesize the transformative demands such harms reciprocate upon us, variable, transformable agents. So our day-to-day continuity of this world is put on abrupt hold, and that's a best-case scenario. And the mortality rates march tragically upwards under the force of a tiny non-human intrusion. It's neither callous nor uncaring to begin reasoning opportunity in this Benjamin sense. And perhaps it's worth even rescuing that word from its almost immediate knee-jerk connotation with a profit-driven motive. While many may acknowledge a planetary turn on an epistemic level, primarily as a result of Earth systems, perspectives that deal a great blow to frames of reference that undergird the operations of unilateral globalization, what this critical moment makes apparent for the first time on the ground and at such a scale is the situated non-abstract condition of planetary coexistence. Today, this is practiced and experienced with respect to commonly shared vulnerabilities, where it's no longer relevant to envision freedom as containable with individual selfhood, which of course is the primary location in the system design of liberalism, but is rather shifted to the vectors between agents, namely to the location of interrelations. Like that's a shift in location from where freedoms are moved, I think, in this scenario. The shifted location of freedom, of course, perhaps masked by the temporary and immediate unfreedoms of mobility is spontaneously conformed in the choreographic practice of physically isolated yet conceptually entangled solidarity, where a conscious awareness of those vectors is foregrounded rather than the nodal points of individualism that we're more accustomed to in our Western societies. So the catastrophic prospect of returning to the status quo world as it is or was, once the acuteness of these, our choreographic perturbations sort of wanes, would do nothing but index the ignorant circumventing of a critical moment in favor of a familiar world which only benefits the few, and even then not for much longer. And that would be catastrophic. So how this current experience can serve as conditions of enablement for historical opportunity based on the collective reasoning of experience of this crisis that literally proves it makes planetary entanglement experiential, is a narrative that urgently awaits seizing and realizing for better worlds. So I will end at that, and hopefully the audio and everything worked, and I wasn't just talking to myself for this time. I don't hear you.
Sorry, my mic was off.
No.
Just asking if there's any question, people watching it.
Sure.
So, any questions? Anyone? I can ask a question, I guess.
Sure.
It was discussion of opportunity, and I was wondering, how do you kind of go from speculative world to identifying the problem, or what you sort of refer to as the synthesis between ability? Like, what's it kind of touched upon imagination, which I think is like also where the other world is. But like, how do you talk about that?
About the connection between the existing world and the other world, that sort of linkage?
Yeah, or like the synthesis that you're referring to.
Right. Well, I think the thing that I've like worked on a little in another context was, I guess, trying to find a middle way between just this like willy-nilly speculation, right? Like taking this diagnosis of social stagnation, and then imagining one should just, that anything other than the stagnation is okay or desired, per se desired. I think that's really risky and not how one needs to go about it, responsibility. So I became interested in, like, where do you build the possibility to have a sort of accountability between the world as it is and another world, right? Because if you're just going to do the delirious speculation, then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, then how do you like, where's any sort of accountability in those, maybe wild speculations? So, and these terms of variance and invariance were raised to me by Inigo Wilkins, which I thought were really helpful to kind of pose it, to understand this kind of balance between these two. And that basically stems from this one premise of world making that Nelson Goodman maps out in his Ways of World Making, which he basically says, what is it like? Is basically every new world is a remaking of the world at hand, right? And so what struck me in that configuration is like, okay, well, that would mean that one would need to have an account of the world at hand, right? The contents of the world at hand, or the configuration of the world at hand, which means one needs a kind of very robust diagnostics in order to know what material or stuff is there ready to be reconfigured, right, for another world. But then you need to find a way to deal with this kind of variance and invariant space in the sense that an other world then is never this absolutely new, totally other thing, right? Because you're always maybe reconfiguring material histories. That's when like Negrostani talks about like repurposing pathways unseen by the past, repurposing those trajectories to give them a new frame of reference, to introduce new perspectives that would then constitute another world configuration. But it's not this degree zero absolute like novelty, you know, in that sense. And so there's always, and I don't think it's, and I think this kind of, if people say, oh, that's just reformist, I don't think that's what's at stake here. You know, I don't think it's this like revolutionary or reformist position. I think it's like, I think it's kind of, yeah, I think it's something other. I don't, you have to forgive me, I'm a bit tired tonight, but I don't think
it's also 11 p.m.
place it in those like absolute frames.
Okay, well, I have a question. So he's asking, are you saying that learning, aka only learning about planetary entanglements, would be process? And if yes, how does the diagrammatic form advance that?
I'm not sure. I mean, I was maybe taking a little bit of a, when I talk about unlearning, I wasn't talking about it in the sense of the planetary necessarily. I was more, I guess, trying to get trying to put my 2 cents in. I mean, we don't see the term as much now in the art world, but for like last year, it was all over the place. And I kept thinking, wow, to me, the term means like we're actually saying that somebody has a surplus of knowledge they could like selectively undo or selectively dispose of. I mean, you're almost granting more power to someone because you have a surplus of knowledge, you can afford to lose it. And I think what unlearning is trying to helpfully do is talk about dehabituation, habits of thought, doing habits of thought. But in terms of this experiential, is there a place where I can read the question again, just so I can, or could you paste it just so I can have a glance?
Whoops. I can maybe. Here.
There we go. That's cool. Are you saying that? Sorry. Oh no, I don't think. I wouldn't say that. I mean, I would say. I mean, you're getting into like some kind of. You'd have to kind of have a proper like cognitive theory about learning here, if I understand correctly from your question, because I'm not. Let's just say that I would privilege a mode of learning based on possibilities of interaction. So these are both, you know, possibly, you know, embodied interactions. They're interactions with tools, with diagrams, for instance. So I think that's what I mean by learning is a kind of series of appraising sets of interactions and like how that feeds back into, you know, changing your concepts. So, I mean, to me, and I think the diagrammatic form, I mean, maybe, I think that there's a lot to be said about diagrams. I mean, I think, you know, I always really like this like Deleuzian definition of a diagram is that it's like a prosthetics of thought. And that I find that really a helpful thing on a more banal level. I mean, not that what I showed tonight was particularly diagrammatic. I mean, there's much more advanced diagrams that one can do. But I think just on a more casual level, I will say I feel like I only understand a concept in a robust way when I can diagram it. So like diagramming is almost a no bullshit meter test in a way. And what I do appreciate about the diagrammatic is that it's a compression device. And what it allows you to do is to kind of like I've said this before, is I think it's almost like a zip file, right? Where you can, or let's say an MP3 compression, where yes, it's not the same as being at the symphony with the proper exact thing, but the compression is sufficient enough that you get the central, qualities of whatever. And a diagram to me can have the ability to compress an incredible amount of information. It's not always understandable without narration on top, which is, I think, an interesting way to treat diagrams as a kind of as a dialogic tool, in a way, to kind of narrate on top of these diagrams. And I don't think, I think that there's also these spaces where, if I understood Jessie correctly, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, is that there would be an opposition between the experiential and the diagrammatic. And I'm not sure that I would agree with that separation. Again, if I understood correctly, and maybe I'm projecting. But I think that there's the whole space of, gesture and whatever that go into diagramming as well. So I think that there's...
Jessie says, got it, interactions is what I was missing. So I guess maybe also relating to this, when he's talking about entanglement is like sort of the learning and the entanglement that happens during learning. Maybe the idea of entanglement that people sometimes presume, I guess. I have some other questions. So this one, wondering how utopia in regards to this spec and the notions of accountability that you were talking about in the end.
How would I describe it? Or what would be my premise? Well, let's say if the idea is to dissuade anyone from thinking utopia, if the choice is between an absolute forbidding of anyone thinking of utopia versus having certain models of utopia circulating that can be, discussed and so on, then I would be okay. Yes, I think it's better that we have these ideas circulating. Of course, it's probably more apt. I mean, I think one important thing to emphasize is, the problem of having this kind of total world now, whereas as the kind of erasure of worlds in plural. So if you would apply that to utopia, I mean, because the problem of utopia, of course, is utopia from whose perspective. I think China Mayville had a very beautiful quote. It's we already live in utopia, it's just someone else's. And that's I think that's pretty accurate, right? It's so it's maybe not our idea of utopia, but I'm sure my idea of utopia is definitely not somebody else's, So it's maybe dangerous to speak about it in a singular way in that sense. But in terms of if you're just going to squash anyone from thinking about the possibilities of other worlds, then absolutely not. It's a question of, but thinking about it accountably, of course, means utopia for who, from whose perspective, within which constraints, what are your frames of reference, et cetera, right? But I do think that China Mayville quote is kind of, it's a kind of brutal reminder that we're already in utopia. It's not for you.
Someone's utopia, or someone's future or past. Okay, one more question. Let's see if I can show both. Okay, so 2 parts. Lika's saying,
hey,
you talked about the causality realization of human and the world model, and that instead of nodes of neoliberalism, otherworldliness needs other non-ego-driven images of human actor. And then she says, have you thought about any particular images or what that would look like? Do you want me to go back to the first?
Yeah, I mean, sure. It's well, definitely. I mean, I think. I mean, obviously, this kind of reduction of it's just, I mean, it's in a way like, to kind of go back to the Sylvia Wynter point, right? Is that in a way the human self-conception becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of a social order. And so when people say that we are, you know, biologically predestined to be assholes and greedy and only care for our own, it's really hard. I mean, first of all, that's a kind of wrong essentialism. No one can actually prove that. And second of all, we also live in conditions that incentivize exactly that behavior. So it is extremely difficult to, and it's actually kind of an act of courage anytime someone demonstrates a non-egoistic gesture, which are plentiful. We see it all the time, right? But if you think about it in the context, kind of brutal competitive context that we live in, it's even more valorization on those gestures because it's a total act of defiance against that preconception, right? And it's something we experience every day, even people that adhere to that competitive model know what generosity is, know what, So on the specific like image of the human, I mean, of course, I'm thinking more in terms of cooperative relations. I think I've been thinking about it more, but not in any sort of robust ways. I don't have a big theorization, but more about where social structures, like if you imagine, like liberalism is a kind of governance design proposal, and you have different like elements of this, and you take the principle of freedom and you could place it anywhere in this configuration, and where do you place it on the individual? So therefore, like the kind of nature of laws and sets of ideals are privileged around the idea of freedom as belonging to an individual, and that model is not really functional anymore, I think. And that's what I was trying to say, is I think this is actually an interesting thing, because we maybe aren't free in the sense that we can go and fly around and put a lot of carbon emissions in the air at the moment, but we're kind of relocating where our freedoms are, and the freedom right now for the broader good is located in between us at the moment, not on me, not on you, but in between us. And the performance of self-isolation is basically kind of acknowledging that. And I think that's that's why I think this is actually quite is a very powerful lesson, especially for those of us who've grown up, especially in North America. I can say that because I'm North American, where it's, even the individualism is like ramped up, right? And we don't necessarily know how to think outside of that framework. And so I'm just saying that that's maybe where, I know I'm disappointing Mika, but she's way too smart for me anyways. But I would just say I'm interested in where social structures, where they situate freedom, or their, not only the conception of what that is, but also where they place it and where that gets emphasized.
Cool. Thanks so much. A few people said they're clapping. I have one more last question for you, and I guess then we'll wrap up unless somebody else wants to ask another one.
Sure.
Just this one. Tyrone is asking, how much does language in other worlds? So I imagine also different knowledge of different languages.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's colleagues of mine who are much better, would be much more able to give you a fantastic answer, because they're like Wittgenstein scholars, right? But just kind of coming at it from a perspective of let's say like a sensorial perspective. I think that obviously different languages give you different affordances, different approaches, different grammars force different behavior on you, like how in English you can cut somebody off immediately, so you can just say your point at the very beginning. In German, I have to wait, they say their thing and then nicht, and then I get mad, right? So you can't, it's harder to interrupt in German. So there's like those minor behavioral things. But I think the question of, there's like, if you think about the worlds and the frames of reference, right? There's like terms and terminologies and a proper configuration even within a language that reinforces those sorts, that the logic of that world and the types of behaviors that happen. And so I think, and this is where Winter and the scholar, brilliant scholar Catherine McKittrick, who often dialogues with Winter, talks about the way this sociogenic principle that I mentioned earlier, right, where you have the human self-referent and then you have all these, the derivative social structures sort of emerge in the likeness and incentivize adaptation to that human figure. Well, this also goes into the epistemic order, which then starts to produce what they call adaptive truths. So this is McKittrick and Winter call them adaptive truths, or genre-conforming adaptive truths. So in terms of disrupting that regime, right, these adaptive truths are kind of just reinforcing, you know, if you want, confirmation bias, et cetera, et cetera. So the question of other worlds then is also a question of like non-adaptive truths in a way. And I'm really curious about how art, how literary practices can start to, you know, work on those kind of non-adaptive elements to kind of, you know, coax our sensorium outside of a certain referential framework that we're bound to at the moment. Because at its best, I mean, good artworks are always sort of, you know, tinkering with the frames of reference that guide a normal sensorium, right? So I think absolutely language, not just in terms of, you know, if it's Korean or if it's Japanese or if it's English or Spanish or whatever, but just language as a medium, as a correlative medium to accessing reality, because that's what we have to describe it, to understand it, and to share in it. That I think it does play quite a pivotal role in making these, you know, adjustments in configuration.
I have a couple more questions from that, maybe just to answer just quickly.
Sure.
Are you?
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere. Yeah.
So Kika is asking, how does the diagram software influence? I guess when you're, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. If it does, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just use Illustrator, so it's not like a special diagram software, but it's Illustrator. So like any software, it has its particular constraints. And I mean, how did this diagram builder limit or shift the thinking in this talk? Oh, well, to be honest, like I think, because I know I tend to speak sometimes a bit abstractly, or things can be dense when they're spoken. So I've been finding just diagrams extremely helpful as a communication tool, and especially for online things, you don't have to look at my face. You can just like look at a nice 2D thing. But in a more serious like exercise, like when, you know, you write an essay or you come up with a new idea and then you're trying to really synthesize, like not on individual slides, but like really encapsulate one essay in a single diagram. That's, yeah, I mean, that's when I feel like I really understand what I'm trying to say, in a sense. But I'm like, so how did the diagram builder limit or shift the thinking of this talk? I don't know, I guess I'm not
like the limitation
on that point, but one thing that is important though is, you know, in all seriousness, like software is, when we just talk about these adaptive truths, right, before these kind of, you have these frames of reference, they permeate knowledge structure, permeate intellectual structures, they're embedded in our software as well, and that's where these they get repeated, right? And the one major example is, of course, like modeling software, like, you know, AutoCAD software, anything like architectural rendering. I mean, it's still bound to a very specific Renaissance picture of space is the default quote unquote neutral setting. And that's like a very powerful spatial adaptive truth that is rehearsed every time someone opens these kinds of software. And so it may, you know what I'm saying? Like, so I think that there's a lot of these, if you look around, there's like loads of these residues in a sense of these adaptive truths. So I find the Winter and McKittrick framing of this adaptive truth incredibly powerful coming from an arts background, because you're like, okay, so every system generates these artifacts. So what would it mean to generate an artifact from another world with other perspectival frames of reference? You have to first invent that world, invent the logics, and imagine the kind of objects that would come out of that world. And that, I don't know, that to me is kind of sounds kind of promising, because then you're serving up devices, you know, like to go back to Jesse's question, you're serving up devices to interact with the possibility space that you've invented. So it's not just this kind of, you're actually giving something tangible for the mind to negotiate.
I have a question that's probably a little bit related, but maybe more general, is sort of how did you become interested in this, or how did you access this research first?
Because I think the world needs to change. I think it's pretty simple. Yeah. It can't go on the way it is. I think that there's some really serious opportunities in our moment that need to be, and again, opportunities in the Benjamin sense, not like in the cha-ching sense. I think that there's an urgency. I know, and before COVID, there's an urgency. I think it's increasingly being felt, and it needs to be narrated, and it needs to be claimed. And so, yeah, I'm interested in people that are also trying to think through this.
Okay, and then definitely last question. Shani is asking, you know, you spoke of embodied interactions with tools, and one, can you elaborate on other tools and approaches to the concept of practice in their embodied use? So I guess.
Yeah, sure. Like, actually, like the person I would, or the book I would suggest if you're interested in that is, oh my God, the book that Kojo Eshun wrote in '98. What was it? I'm like, but okay. So he invents this. He's got all these like portmanteau or neologisms in that book, and one of them is called concept techniques. And so he was looking. I mean, he was like, that book is a lot about like hip hop music and music culture in general. But then he was like talking about the way that the interactions with these tools change the conceptual space, which of course it turns into this feedback loop of like, you interact with a tool, it changes your space of conceptual affordance, that then allows you to interact with the tool differently or alter it, and so on and so on. So he's got this nice word for just like smashing concepts and techniques together. And then there's another, but then there's like a cognitive theory that's called the artifactual mind thesis. And it's basically talking about, again, this feedback dynamic between, you know, the tools aren't just an extension of the mind, an externalization of the human mind. They then allow for interaction, which the tools then alter us, and so on and so forth. So basically, I'm kind of putting it in a very dumb, oversimplified way, but basically, like in that way, your mind is a kind of is an artifact of the kind of period of tool use one would have, basically. Oh. I'm putting it in a very stupid way. I'm like, it's been like, I think this is like the 11th hour today. But
taxonomy, like sort of.
What's that?
Yeah. In like taxonomical terms, like your mind becomes sort of a witness to a certain time of tool usage. Or
well, I think maybe I'm stretching it a bit, but
no, okay, good.
Yeah, but basically, I mean, I think what's the most important is to kind of, it's more about this feedback dynamic between the two. So how they're kind of mutually working on each other and transforming each other, for the good and for the bad, right? These are like, when you say transform, that doesn't necessarily mean great, wonderful, right? It could be injurious. You know, it's not necessarily, when I speak about it, it's not like all yay, fantastic, but it's a process. So how does one deal with that process, and negotiate it? Like, how do you basically?
That's good. Yeah, that's amazing. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I wish you were here with us in Toronto and we could go for a drink right now.
I know. Well, not because you're sick. I mean, literally, it's like not even senior hour to eat dinner.
I know. But if you can, there's a place where they could access some of your writing and some of your work, especially the recent work involving these diagrams. And we'll get some links and I'll post it on the event page.
Yeah.
That would be really awesome. And yeah, I just want to thank you for joining us. This was really great. And thanks.
Yeah, next time in person.
Yeah, have a great night.
You too.
Bye.
Ciao. Thank you.